Hello, this is Dan Winter back with you again. It's March 2021 from fractalfield.com. Today's subject is ETs, Stargates, Angels, and Ancestor physics versus practical spiritual electrical hygiene. Now, as we look back on our many recordings here from the fractalfield.com YouTube channel with over 1 million views, I'm grateful to say, to see where the interest is, and the interest is clearly actually relates to the extraterrestrial history and how that relates to modern physics. And that's a good interest, and I want to use that interest in order to deliver also some messages about practical spiritual electrical hygiene. You know that although many of our inventions have to do with healing, Therify.net and flameandmind.com for bliss meditation, the fact is that I'm not medically trained and am careful not to claim to be. However, I am an electrical engineer, and a lifetime of electrical engineering skill regarding spiritual evolution means that we can give some seriously meaningful professional advice about the electrical hygiene for spiritual evolution in terms of electrosmog in your environment and practical things to do on a daily basis, given a knowledge of the big picture. So, in this conversation, we want to start with a review of the context of the big picture and then apply that locally. Think globally, act locally. Apply that locally in terms of practical things we can do every day, given new information we now have that ancestor memory and the collective unconscious are specifically longitudinal electrical fractal array, like how they use the ancestor Olmec black obsidian mirror to see ancestors. Now we know how those devices helped communicate with ancestors. Ancestor memory is real, and it is in fact an array of charge in a longitudinal fractal global dodecacosa, as it were. And so that memory array is accessible under certain circumstances. And so once we understand the physics of how the community of saints, the Akashic records, ancestor memory, or dreamline song tracks, we now know there's a very specific physics to having those communications be practical, and it requires electrical hygiene. I mean, obviously, in our modern age, we appear to becoming quote-unquote soulless, and we all feel that agony, but few of us have thought about what that actually means electrically. Interestingly, if we could agree electrically on what it means to become soulless, then governments and universities could take action if there was something measurable about it. But until then, unfortunately, soullessness propagates. For example, the way in which birth is practiced, as it differentiates which ETs are losing their bloodlines and which are not. So that's are losing the coherence and integrity of their bloodline and which are not. And so that's the big picture theme we want to start with here, which is, what have we learned from a lifetime, in my case, of study of galactic history versus practical, immediate human medical practices and hygiene practice that affect whether we become the Borg or whether we in fact have a soul? What does that mean? And we believe firmly now that electrical engineering can teach us the difference between practices that make us soulless, that is, do not have a coherent longitudinal bubble, the Ba from the Ka, the Kesjan body, all these terms we have for your light body, your rainbow body. Everybody has a name for this. But now that electrical engineers can talk about what it is to evolve a coherent bubble of charge around your body, extension of the concept of cold plasma in your aura, that's longitudinally penetrant, which means that it is coherent in the sense that compression is perfected. There's a kind of stillness. It relates to all the spiritual practices we've been taught about the value of meditation and stillness and feeling the leverage of the still point and the center point. All this spiritual language which has been useful, but now that has an electrical underpinning. We know what that means. That means that as you feel that stillness implode and penetrate, in my case, the story of my 20, 30 years of Kundalini experience, which our professional documentary about has been very well received. You can see the 6-part professional film on the physics, and I do mean physics, of Kundalini bliss at goldenmean.info/Kundalini. So during those experiences, I have come to have a perspective on what it meant when I felt that lightning, and even as I feel it somewhat now up the tailbone, I feel that lightning compression still point. Instead of calling that insanity, we know what it is. We know that, in fact, there's a rapid climax of metabolism with a cascade of long-wave frequencies from the spine liquid pump and the breathing. Cascade implodes between the heart harmonics and the brain waves achieving that golden ratio trance state. I can even create that kind of bliss right here. I can feel it now. I feel my hair standing up here. I feel that stillness penetrate. And so what I'm feeling is my aura, having imploded and compressed, is able to propagate more efficiently. So implosion always precedes explosion. The implosion precedes radiance. So before the rose can unpack, it must be packed perfectly. That's the physics of implosion, the precedent, the lead up to all real bliss experience. And what we call the evolution of consciousness is specifically electrically that ability of the electric field of the body having imploded to then begin to radiate. So as you become more centripetal, that electric field gets bigger and bigger. And we call that the evolution of consciousness. Consciousness with turning inside out-ness. So that implosion, non-destructive self-reentry, big donut around the head, plasma vortex, you can see through that tornado, it becomes an eyeball. So that unpacking radiance in the aura, literally the evolution of consciousness, is delimited by some very practical electrical factors. For example, and we're going to talk about this here, the sacred Mount Canigou is over there, and there's a magnetic line that's quite strong that I can feel it actually passing through this couch that I'm sitting on, which is my favorite place to meditate and take a nap, actually. And as I'm on that line, if I close my eyes, and actually when I'm lying down, even more than I'm sitting up, in this case, I can feel, when I close my eyes, I can feel a wormhole opening above my head. And first it gets all kinds of light happening there. And then if I get really focused, I can see pictures in that light, just like Patrick reported in our brainwave project to help kids use trance bliss to see without their eyes, flameinmind.com/outervision. We're just about to release an exciting new documentary about that biofeedback brainwave project in the Netherlands with Iris there and Vindor, the magic little girl, and Ari went up there and made a film. So that film will be released very shortly. And basically, all the kids are clear. They get into this trance bliss state, they're blindfolded, and then a tunnel, a vortex, a wormhole opens, and they look down and they're seeing through that little vortex wormhole, which gradually gets bigger, and looking down through that vortex tornado, completely blindfolded, they get a little periscope and they can see. And so that tornado vortex of plasma that we call consciousness develops an eyeball and vision, specifically when it's charge implosive. So we are the first one to explain the physics, and I do mean the plasma physics, of why it is you can take your vision outside your body if you're plasma coherent. Never before has any electrical engineer sat in front of you and said, this is how your vision goes with you when you lucid dream, remote view, astral travel, and when you die. So suddenly we have a very specific understanding of what consciousness is. Consciousness is a plasma tornado. As we say to all the other people claiming to study the physics of consciousness, if you have not explained how vision can operate outside your body, and if you have not explained why focused attention causes charge to compress, then you do not have a physics of consciousness. We do. So if you'd like to learn about the physics of consciousness, you need to understand about the plasma tornado theory of vision. So anyway, so these kids are learning to see without their eyes, and Patrick is sitting with Magic Vindor, and he's wrote all the software for flameandmind.com, and said, suddenly a little tunnel opened in front of me when I was blindfolded, and I began to see shadows through the tunnel. So just by sympathetic resonance, he began to see without his eyes, because he learned to grab hold and squeeze and compress that vortex tornado inside your head until the point where the tornado comes to a point. Now, we happen to know where that point is, where the pinecone kiss noses, and that point is specifically Planck times exponents of golden ratio. That's how the tornado works. And the reason is simple. Remember, when the pinecone of implosion by golden ratio Caduceus hermetic cascade of harmonics implodes and squeezes down to the perfect toothpaste tube, that the transverse inertia, the inertia of the electromagnetics that do not go as far as the longitudinal. So the transverse waves enter that vortex, they spin down that vortex cone, and they come out the toothpaste tube, and then they're a compressional longitudinal wave, and they propagate further, and they can go through Faraday cages at a distance. And when those longitudinal waves cross at a distance, they create action at a distance because they resynthesize the transverse component, and they can contain heat at a distance at the cross point fractal nodes. The physics of how Ingo Swann repeatedly heated that thermistor with the flame in his mind, flameandmind.com, at a distance through a Faraday cage. Repeatedly it was measured. So how did he heat that item at a distance? Einstein was wrong to call it spooky. The correct term is longitudinal interferometry. And that propagating array is the introduction to the physics of why you need a phase conjugate mirror to implode and pick up those longitudinal components if you want to talk to your ancestor. Whether it's a obsidian black mirror for the Olmec, or whether it's a black phase conjugate coating on the bottom of Nostradamus's water scrying cup for seeing the future, or whether it is the black mirror surface of the show stone of John Dee, who used it to talk to angels. That is a quasi-phase conjugate mirror introduction to the physics of scrying, which is the physics of picking up the longitudinal EMF array, which is the collective unconscious, ancestor memory, how DNA radio works, and all the cool stuff. So, we were going to talk about ET Stargates, angels, and ancestor physics. We have a bit introduced the idea of ancestor physics here. As we said, this is how ancestors propagate. And angels, obviously, are the large plasma bodies of those who have graduated, where your plasma field is bigger. You know, Michael Sarian said that John Dee released some dangerous stuff to this planet by calling in angels. Well, big plasma bodies are like humans. Some of them like us and some of them don't. So yes, there are such things as angels who are a bit impatient with humans. That's obvious. But remember, as we often say, I think virtually every single scientist who runs the Plasma Universe website believes in angels now. They've seen these plasma bodies, interstellar, they're organized, they're coherent. So we know what an angel is. And you see, when John Dee used this, we should dig it out here. Here it is. Okay, so there is, these are the letters right here of the Ophanim-Enochian alphabet as they appeared in the movie Stargate. And we know that these are a hypercube geometric lens to implode plasma charge in order to introduce this vortex effect. So here is the origin of the Ophanim-Enochian alphabet that John Dee and Kelly saw in their phase conjugate black showstone scrying mirror, which we see their elements or pieces of the vortex. And if you take those pieces of the vortex and make a map, you have this Ophanim-Enochian alphabet, which is a 64 matrix. We will see hypercube, and you see how the angel names are written: Zabkiel, Zadkiel, Hunael, Mikael. The names of the angels are the sequence of symmetry operations which assemble their body. Their name, their shape, and their service are one. This is plasma physics. This is what John Dee was doing. And if, as Vincent Bridges so beautifully pointed out, if you assemble that array and look at the symmetry of the letters of that array, you get a hypercube. So what's happening here in the movie Stargate, this is the 5 spins inside, the 7 spins outside. We thought that's the Anu slipknot, but more, that's the 7 spins of the tetracube embedded inside the 5 spins of the dodecaecosa, which is the non-destructive implosive charge collapse, which is the key to alchemy and Stargates, literally how to make a black hole. So these letters in the movie Stargate were used to lens effect implode the plasma donuts. So when they converge, the movie wasn't too bad. You have that thin plasma surface, and you stick your finger through the vortex. As you go through the center of that vortex, that implosion is implosive phase conjugate propulsion phase velocity wave vector acceleration. It's another way of saying that what you call acceleration at that point is the fact that you then become embedded in the phase conjugate fractal nodal array of longitudinal interferometry. Literally the grid, which we now know is dodecaecosa, whether you're talking about the sacred Earth grid or where the pyramids are or the arrangement of masses in the universe, it's all dodecaecosa, just like DNA. And the reason for that is that's the nodal array, not just of gravity stabilization, but the only form of efficient wave communication that exists, all of which is tuned to Planck times Golden ratio. So what happens in a Stargate is that if you have your attention coherent, you can be propelled, accelerate, and you will then re-emerge at a remote node faster than light if the send point and the receive point have exactly the same broad spectral phase conjugate symmetry array. In other words, you have to set up the same exact electrical conditions from the send point to the receive point. So here's a practical introduction to that. We know the Therify.net, that phase conjugate plasma that we're doing rejuvenation successfully in 25 countries. We now have beautiful feedback from Maya and others that, in fact, in many cases, not only do we have 30% of the people report either a bliss experience or a sharpening of vision, but Maya reported a dramatic triggering of lucid dreaming. Now, we believe we understand the physics of that. Remember, lucid dreaming, the ability to embed in that longitudinal array, is probably the best predictor we have of who will take memory through death, who has a coherent longitudinal Ka bubble of charge, ability to lucid dream, and therefore, who has a soul. Hello. Why, remember, in the ET history, why did the gray Kumirs, paid by the Dracos, abduct mostly the indigenous blood lucid dreamers? Well, guess what they needed from humans? A little bit of soul. This is our trump card in the ET history, is how to have soul. We need to know what that is electrically, or else we don't understand our own value in the ET history. So the physics of why phase coherent implosive noble gas longitudinal plasma array, example Therify.net, triggers lucid dreaming is that it makes your longitudinal bubble have more centripetal inertia coherence and therefore more projectable. Literally the Shem, access to a black hole, Anu, sun god, Sheman. A shaman is one who can project their plasma, literally plasma projecting. The physics of what it is to be a Jedi. So, if we took that kind of array at much higher power and much more broad spectral, and how broad spectral it is determines ... the potency of the Stargate, the wormhole. Physics knows that they call it entanglement, but entanglement perfected is what phase conjugation is. Perfect embed-ability is what fractality is, which phase conjugation defines the climax condition, Golden ratio times Planck. It's all the fractalphysics.com. So we actually have a pretty good idea of what a Stargate is, and if you compare to all the teachers, the recent ones at Gaia TV, I think are actually doing quite a useful job describing this. Randy Kramer, Jason Rice. I think they're doing, no knowledge of physics there, but describing practically how ETs have been using the Stargates. They're actually doing a reasonably good job. But if you want to understand the physics of how it works, you might need me. But so let's step back a bit. We wanted to do this in a bit of sequence. The context, the big picture here, obviously, is the big picture of ET history. And that's where we started this conversation when I had this graphic up of the origin of the term Uru, which means ancient Draco blood, ancient dragon blood, which is the origin of all our words, Anagur, Hungary, Uru, Iberu, Nibiru, Uruan, Roman, Asa Uru, Asuras, Uru, Asa LM, Jerusalem, Durga, Guru. If you see the Uru in almost all the ancient sacred words, somebody said, probably needs to say, well, who the heck was Uru? Hello, all you ancient anthropologists and ET history students. If Uru is the center of all these words, somebody needs to tell you who the heck Uru was. And Uru was ancient dragon blood, literally, potentially the high end of the Draco ancestry, and their genetic disaster, the fallen component, as it were, of the Uru history, literally fallen angels, became what we call the Anunnaki, which locally became Enki's family, Enki and Enlil, and we have this graphic here. See if I can find it. Here it is. So Enki's family, Enlil and Enki, became the name for God in just about every tradition on Earth. In Egyptian, Enki was Ptah Atun, and Enlil was Amun. In Greek, Enki was Poseidon, and Enlil was Zeus. In Roman, Enlil was Jupiter. In Babylonian, Enki was Ea, and Enlil was Enlil. In African, Enki was Atum and Kilimanjaro. I learned that from Credo Mudwa personally. In Christian, Enki was Lucifer, and Enlil was Michael. In Norse, Loki and Odin. It goes on and on. So that particular family had a big influence on Earth, the Uru. Now, my book on Enki is goldenmean.info/Enki, who became Osiris. We now know that why every single statue in Egypt of Enki, who is, according to many, Osiris, why did every single statue have a green face? Well, hello, here is our friend Anton Parks, who spent his life, who I think did quite a good job, actually, dissecting the Anunnaki family history from the moment Enki, here he is on the top, woke up in the cloning cooking pot in Pleiades, running from the female-dominated Pleiadian culture. And then when they landed on Earth and used humans for mostly slaves and snack food, every single religion they started began with fear of women. Why? As we say, the Pleiadian. Now today, let's take a little vignette from that ancient history. Today, the Tagat and Pleiadian communications, there are many sources on this planet, but one of whom is Gosha, communicating supposedly Swaru, at Cosmic Agency and YouTube.com, on their YouTube channel. Well, they have a tremendous prejudice, the Pleiadian perspective versus the Enki Anunnaki perspective. And I'm not taking either side here. I'm saying the humanoids, Enki's kids, whom he loved, even though he was pretty much a trickster too, need to understand their value in the big picture. Now, interestingly, the big picture, whether you get the galactic history from the Andromedans or the Pleiadians, as I have, and others, even the Greys have announced, the Ebens have announced their big picture of galactic history, and nobody disagrees. They all say the same thing. The Draco reptilian did a massive slaughter of probably millions, if not billions, of humanoids in the Lyran sector, and the diaspora of humanoids. And now the humanoids are one of the most common intelligent species. There are tens of thousands of humanoid species in this galactic sector alone. We're not unique, sorry, no. But we have some value if you can get a soul, but otherwise, it ain't so good. That's the story of this Maury. But anyway, so when the Pleiadians and Andromedans tell the galactic history story, and there's many places to read that, my source originally was Alex Collier, and then I had, I'm grateful to say, some pretty significant, I guess you could say, clairvoyant telepathic communications with some of the Andromedans, Phaseus and Morine, notably Phaseus, who was introduced to me originally by Alex Collier, who's famous for communicating with the Andromedans, but then later Med here, who Mediator Medius, who communicated with Pleiadian and Andromedan for many years, and that their Andromedan description of this galactic history and the Pleiadian description, they match. That part of it matches. But when you get local, that's where the prejudices really get messy, and that's what I want to explain a little bit more about. So then at that point, when there was a humanoid diaspora from Lyra, the reptilian Draco Uru were winning those wars. However, the Pleiadians, as they did then and do now, were leading the battle against the reptilian Draco, and locally, for a long time, the Pleiadians had the biggest guns in our neighborhood. So they chased Enki and Lil's family when they tried to escape running to Earth from the Pleiadians, from the Pleiades, and they set up, as both Andromeda and Pleiadians agree, they set up a kind of frequency fence quarantine to try to hold the Draco reptilians in the Earth's solar system by these nuclear frequency generators in the hollow metal moon, which originally was Andromedan built, or the Federation built. And for some time, the frequency fence, what they did is they regulated the harmonics of the implosive cascade that we today call a Schumann resonance, most of whose harmonics are golden ratio times Planck, and you can see that all over in my work. And it has to do with the fact that the real Schumann resonance 7.83, and we showed those graphics in the previous film in this series, versus the theoretical correct Schumann harmonic golden ratio times Planck would be 7.2. About 7.928 hertz. And that difference, if you multiply by golden ratio, comes to 50 versus 53 hertz. And we measured 53 hertz in the pyramids, for example, Sam's in Bosnia, but we knew that the actual implosive harmonic should have been 50. And that's an example of the difference that you can demodulate the implosion of the planet, which Christians call the rapture. The implosion of the planet is the phase conjugate implosion, and the rapture is the physics of the onset of the longitudinal bubble, in which the guns will melt, pure intention only will survive. Well, when plasma becomes implosive and propagates fractally, only the shareable wave survives literally, which is the physics of perfected wave propagation and the psychology of pure intention. They are the same. So, but the example of when that gets local, and when you start to get the localized problems, so the nuclear generators in the moon are now decaying, and the implosion of the planet is increasing. The rapture comes. And the number of lucid dreamers potentially can increase if we stop some of our soulless behavior, which is living in electrosmog buildings and birth without orgasm, things that affect whether we have a soul. If we get longitudinal coherent enough to have a propagating coherent bubble. Locally, the examples of the conflict, the Pleiadians, like the Anunnaki, Enki's family, they have problems of ensoulment. Now, the Anunnaki, Enki, Draco family, called Nephilim, or the fallen ones. Remember, the symptoms of being a fallen ones are quite simple: loss of long-term memory, loss of ability to take memory through death. That's what fallen means, which literally means loss of soul. And a big part of this film is the physics of what that means. So, since Enki's other name was Nudiwood, which means the cloner, and cloning was the only legal mechanism of replication at the time, you can guess that most births were sans orgasm, meaning a little bit soulless. So indeed, and it's classic in Draco history that they had lost long-term memory. So we know they had a problem of genetic sustainability. This is the key theme of our story today, is what creates genetic sustainability. So when Enki's family, Thoth Hermes, Thothmosis, the royal lines of Egypt is named for Thoth, Enki's partner, the science officer, Hermes, when they set up Atlantis, Thoth, of course, the Pleiadians, if you listen to Swaru, at Cosmic Agents, you say, well, Atlantis was evil. That was reptilian. Well, yes, but they have a little prejudice here. So let's look at the other side of that story. The Pleiadian Tegatans matriarchy, which they say was pretty innocent. Actually, it's not innocent at all. By resorting to parthenogenesis, they have approximately 70 to 80% females and only 20 to 25% males. And the males, they say they're not sex slaves, but actually the Pleiadians, we have written evidence of males being abused by the female dominant Pleiadians. Now that's, our patriarchy is pretty perverse, so let's not point fingers here. You know, those who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. But the real issue, and this is the issue that we want to focus on here. Actually, we believe that Swaru, for example, actually was responsible for the death of her own mother. They don't admit. And they also don't admit why the Pleiadians were kicked out of the Federation of Planets. Remember the group that originally set up the quarantine and tried to defend against the Draco reptilians? Because the Pleiadians were famous for abusing humans. And how were they abusing them? That's what we need to get here. They needed something genetically. Remember when I said, you know, I was teaching at Barbara Marciniak, the famous Pleiadian Center in North Carolina, and we realized that the Pleiadians were encouraging promiscuity. I said, well, what do they get out of this? They need something. And specifically, the pregnant women were the ones the Pleiadians like to, we could say, infest or astrally embed in, or, you know, embed in their bodies and learn something. So when they feel the feelings of love for a human mother with a baby, it's something those Pleiadians queens desperately need. Why? What is the clue here? Well, here now, when my teacher originally on some of this, Alex Collier, emphatically says the Andromedans have announced 700 to 900 years, the Pleiadians, we assume they mean Tegatan Pleiadians, in 700 to 900 years, the genetic lineage of those Pleiadians is going to fall apart. And these Andromedans, they know something about this. They have the biggest ships. They have the most evolved consciousness. It's true the Pleiadians had the biggest guns, but the biggest ships and the most evolved consciousness is not Pleiadian. So when the Andromedans said the Pleiadians are losing it genetically, this was a clue. And here it is. So if you use forms of childbirth that do not involve orgasm, in the long term, the plasma implosion that we call bliss orgasm has a critical role to play in ensoulment through birth. You know, we've studied the physics of if you go through the birth canal properly, the opposite of cesarean section, the implosive change in pressure over time of the perfected birth canal is golden ratio, and then the child has higher IQ, more ensoulment, lucid dreaming, otherwise you need rebirthing, etc., etc. So remember, the underwater birthing is just a way of eliminating the discontinuity of pressure on the decompression of the skull bones, because that is continuity of memory. That's the real physics of rebirthing and ensoulment. So there's a long sort of discussion about what keeps a soul in a DNA bloodline. But believe me, birth with conception, with orgasm is critical, proper mixing of childbirth. So basically, the Pleiadians are just about as screwed up as Draco. Both sides have an agenda, and the agenda has to do with Earth as a DNA library. Look, you know, they come here like we were Disney World because they love to see the antiques humans moving around in cars powered by dinosaurs farting. We are the perfect Disney World, they all. But what do they really need when they come to that genetic library? They need a library card, because a lot of those gene pools are losing it. So the real important thing here, like Suaru was insisting, well, Christianity was just a Roman invention, it's pure politics. You see, you will never hear them talking about the importance of bliss. No, that's exactly what they lost. So, yes, our religions are mostly childish perversity, but there was a core of something beautiful even in Christianity, which was the genetic diversity of the Syrians, which was behind the bloodline. If you read Out of Egypt and all the books on the Egyptian origins of Christianity and sun god, actually every ancient religion, all the good ones, the Egyptians and Christians, were basically sun god religions. And that core concept is useful because when your aura gets big enough, my teacher Bentov could wiggle the earth with his kundalini and eventually see through the heart of the sun. The sun is a big tornado, Anu, from which we get the word Anunnaki and sun god, and the father of Enki. Well, they were all wannabes. They all wanted to be sun gods because, by the way, that's the only way to grow up. If you don't if you don't get your plasma big enough to inhabit a star and steer something a little bigger than a tornado, sorry, you're stuck in kindergarten. That's boring. So the point is that all the ancient religions were sun god religions for a very useful reason. And the Egyptian roots behind Christianity, which were useful, which was beings who became big enough as plasma entities, call them angelics if you'd like, to have the perspective of the intelligence of stars. Our sun is actually profoundly intelligent and evolved. So, and we started this Solar Shamans e-group, if you will, the Solar Heart community at yahoogroups.com, and we had these people, because all these shaman, advanced shaman, all said, well, I got to the heart of the sun, and it's not hot in there at all, it's cool, and it's an eyeball. Well, of course it's an eyeball. It's an organ of perception. It's the only way to grow up. Even Bentov's Kundalini climax was seeing through the heart of the earth and seeing through the heart of the sun. It's getting to the point where you can see through bigger and bigger tornadoes. That's called growing up, the only definition of evolution of consciousness. So we have done our stories here now. We have done our Draco Anunnaki stories. By the way, I recommend very much where Anton Parks describes. Now remember, Anton Parks, he's prejudiced on Enki, who's quite a trickster's side of the family. In fact, in some ways, I think he's forced propaganda for. But his perspective on origins of language is very, very useful. He's saying there was, remember, we've talked many times that Draco had a separate language for the males and females, which became the rule for languages separate for males and females in Aboriginal culture, became the origin of the caste system. And that Proto-Sumerian language, Amanita, was a male language from which would emanate, and that became the Babylonian, and the Akkhaldan, which was what Joseph Smith was studying when he used the Urim and Thummim, the quartz tetrad index, the plasma domains, and the gold and copper foils, which was the genetic records of ancient Draco. So that was a male language versus the female language, which was called Emigir, which became actually ancient Egyptian. And so Proto-Sumerian and the language tree was a document, was a proof of the fact that males and females had a different language. And that is the beginning of the perversity of the War of the Sexes, which is very much related to galactic history. I'll give you a local example of that. I've said this before. We teach the physics of rain-making, why when ancestors die, you have these storms that go across the song line they inhabited in Australia. We were there. But because the male and female tribes in Aboriginal culture, they would often die cursing each other. This was directly related to the desertification of Australia, even as Wilhelm Reich group, James DeMeo, documented that if you follow the propagation of patriarchy, it is a anthropologically documented map of the spread of deserts. So you can make the case historically with great academic rigor that the spread of patriarchy, touch is illegal, that spread of that patriarchy is the cause of deserts. And the physics of why that's true is because permission to touch for people is the same physics as permission to touch for the water vapor required to become a droplet. This is very important if you begin to understand. So the point is that when our friend Malcolm Borgward from Perth did these rituals across the continent of Australia, and they healed the ancient curses that existed between the men tribe and the women tribe in all these aboriginal villages. And as he would take these rituals down the song line, these incredible rainstorms followed them every single time. Hello, is that a clue? You can read all about our physics of rainmaking at goldenmean.info/rain. Anyway, you see, the history of the War of the Sexes is more than local here, and it is an indication of the state of galactic history. So we are going to then conclude this conversation with just a little bit about practical spiritual electrical hygiene. And let me see if we make this a little bit bigger right now. So as an electrical engineer, what are some of the practical things we have done here in terms of creating a dream spell? I mean, creating a coherent longitudinal bubble. I mean, creating a ka from a ba from a ka, creating a Keshan body, creating a higher light body, creating a rainbow light body. What are we going to call it today? It doesn't matter. The point is you need to do it. So what have we done? We have found, for example, that every time we turn the Wi-Fi on, we feel nausea. It's true. And I think Wi-Fi in classrooms is a tragedy. Also, even Bluetooth, for example, we use Bluetooth in flameinmind.com, but I recommend the Bluetooth be on only for a very short time, when necessary, and you turn it off immediately when you're done with it, and never have it on for a long time. It's a short pulsing, and people who are electrosensitive can feel that square wave and the pain that goes with it. Because pain is defined by charge that's bleeding due to loss of fractality. That's the definition of pain. And if you understand that, you can understand why electrosmog is painful. So on the back of this computer, I have Ethernet, but we have Ethernet wires around the house and no Wi-Fi, and it works great. I have this device in which I remotely turn off the fridge and the entertainment center, and every single transformer gets turned off the instant it's finished. We found there were certain rooms where improper grounding meant that the metal appliances, like a metal light fixture or a metal heater, were radiating. And you measure that electrostatic radiance, and you can measure the nausea propagating through your house. Now, we were unable in our little fight to prevent the smart meter from arriving here on electric power, but we installed an expensive $500 filter for the high frequencies and other devices to reduce the electrosmog. So what are we doing? We're, with great discipline, as much as possible, reducing the electrosmog of our surroundings. And we actually know our friends here who actually teach electrosmog remediation, and our technology for measuring electrosmog takes the flameinmind.com/lifeforce, and it amplifies in microvolt, and we can spectrum analyze what part of the room has electrostatic smog. And we did measure the 50 cycle in here, and you turn the main circuit breaker off, and suddenly you can dream better. Hello. So there are many things you can practically do. The other thing is make a magnetic map of your house. You know, rearrange things to look like a rose, and do that for your backyard, etc., etc. Basically, move to nature. So we're saying that you should take the basic, practical, simple measures to create electrosmog hygiene in your environment, because the more your magnetic field looks like a rose, the more consciousness can propagate. So you see, yes, the big picture is humans on Earth were originally mostly slaves and snack food. But remember, the Draco Anunnaki were only one of at least 22 different ET species who were messing with Earth. And there are humanoids all over our galactic sector. We're not that unique. But we probably have more genetic diversity than this genetic library here is very valuable. The ecosystem here is very valuable. So when the Pleiadians refused to admit why the Galactic Federation kicked them out for not respecting the indigenous freedom of indigenous peoples like humans on Earth, there was a great message behind that the Galactic Federation and the cultures that administrate our local galactic neighborhood, as it were, they put a great value on the ecosystem and genetic diversity here because that is priceless. That has value. And we need to know what that value is. You see, genetic diversity is fractality. So the fundamental mistake, let's call it the Monsanto mistake, the fundamental mistake of the Draco Anunnakis was that they believed that DNA that changes is defective. Well, where did they get that belief? Well, you see, on their home star, Alpha Draconis, etc., there was more radioactivity, which meant there was more genetic mutation. So to prevent genetic mutation was one of the biggest things their culture needed to do. So, of course, from their point of view, DNA that changes is defective. And that became the caste system in India and what we call the Monsanto mistake. But the truth is that genetic diversity means that the rate of change of the rate of change of the rate of change of the rate of change, we call it fractal, is actually of value because that's how self-organization and therefore ensoulment can arise. The real physics of the origin of negentropy, which is why it's such a tragedy. Your physics teacher is teaching your kid the universe is condemned to entropy when there is a path out of chaos, which is called the origin of negentropy. Read my book, fractalfield.com. So once we understand the origin of negentropy, which is, Gaia's frequency harmonic Schumann, our implosive phase conjugate cascade to Planck, guess what that is? The physics of why Gaia has been proven scientifically to be negentropic, self-organizing. So if we knew in general the definition of self-organization, we could even define peacemaking. We could, goldenmean.info/peace university. We could define what makes ecosystems negentropic. We have to do that in order to keep this environment fractal. So thank you very much. See you next time.